hope it all goes and we'll be going back to Zion. So we're leaving Babylon and going back to Zion. Leaving Babylon, going back to Zion.
Greetings to those who are tuned in. Today we're going to be discussing the lost tribes of Israel. The reason why they're important is because they play a role in the end times Bible prophecy, which I'll explain later. Now, over the past few centuries, there's been lots of speculation about who the lost 10 tribes of Israel are today. We're in 2024 with modern day technology, so there's no reason why they should still be hidden, which I don't believe they are. I simply believe the world, or at least those who control the world, has purposely refused to acknowledge the existence of these Israelites, and they have failed to give them the same recognition as they have with the Ashkenazi Jews of Europe. So it is not the Israelites of the Bible who are lost today, it is the world who is lost. So let's clear up all the confusion and come up with some answers to where the lost tribes of Israel are today. Now, the reason this video is called The Lost Tribes of Israel in Africa is because there is an historic link, even biblically, between the Hebrews and those who are African. And by Africans, I mean specifically those who are Hamites. So this included Canaanites, Egyptians, as well as Cushite groups during that time. The Hamites did not only border the Semitic people, but they have also interchangeably lived amongst each other in the same regions, which is why collectively they are known as the Afro-Asiatic people. And for those who are unaware, parts of Israel actually sit on the African tectonic plate. So essentially, Israel has always been a part of Africa. There's even times where the ancient Israelites intermarried with the Hamitic people. Not to mention the times that Hebrews were mistaken for being Egyptian all throughout the Bible. And lastly, it was Africa that Jesus, Yahuah, fled to escape from King Herod when he was born. A lot of people have chosen to remain ignorant when it comes to the close relationship between Israel and Africa. A lot of this is due to not reading the Old Testament in the proper historical context that it is written in. This lack of history and knowledge has led to some to come up with their own theories regarding the return of Jesus as well as the regathering of the children of Israel. Some have even speculated that prophecy has already been fulfilled in 1948 when the Ashkenazi Jews returned to the land of Israel. But even in the New Testament, it says that all of Israel will be saved. Romans 11:26. So that means not just the Jews, but all of the Israelites who are scattered across the world. And even the Ashkenazi Jews can attest to this. Hear what they have to say.
It was as authentic it can get. And so when you see the Lemba all the way down to the bottom of Africa, tracing their roots to the Yemenite Jewish community, building in the same structures and having certain traditions that are the same, and like no one else in South Africa, it shows you the far-reaching scale of these Israelite customs and traditions.
Now, while it may not be mainstream, the Ashkenazi Jews are still well aware that there are Israelite tribes that dwell in Africa. These are not converts, but these are people who can actually trace their lineage back to the land of Israel. But don't be deceived by this outreach. The only reason they are barely now acknowledging these lost tribes of Israel is because they want to bring them under their umbrella so that the narrative remains the same when the rest of the world awakens to who they are. They are only in Africa to convert these Israelite tribes to become Jewish just like themselves, all in spite of the fact that they are already blood descendants of Israel. And this is the conversation that they try to avoid as it raises questions to their own place in history.
All those people that are claiming to be Israelis, Israelites, all this new crazy wave that is waking up, and they're claiming, we are the real Jews, you're fake Jews. For me, it's so funny. Why is it so funny? I don't mind that you're claiming to be Jews, like truly, be'emet, from the bottom of my heart. I couldn't care less. You want to claim to be Jews? Claim to be Jewish. Maybe you have Israeli roots. I'm not saying that you do not. Truly, be'emet, I don't care. But why to stand up and to start saying, oh no, you're Ashkenazi. Oh no, you're white. Oh no, you're this. Oh no, you're that. Guys, listen, you don't have a clue of your own history. But look at us, listen carefully, deep into your souls. Listen, we know the history. We gave our lives to write down all the truth. Now, the truth is.
So as you can see, the awakening of the Israelites to the rest of the world can be problematic for some people. With that said, let's get into how these Israelites ended up in Africa. There are multiple verses in the Bible that states the Israelites would be scattered across the world. Psalms 44:11 says, "You have given us like sheep appointed for meat, and have scattered us among the heathen." So at what point did this scattering take place? The scattering began in the first book of Kings. After the reign of King Solomon, Israel became a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom, which was made up by the 10 tribes, were the first to go into captivity. Their last known whereabouts was in the land of Assyria. According to the second book of Kings, chapter 18, verse 11, it says, "The king of Assyria carried Israel into Assyria, and they were placed in the cities of the Persians." Outside of this, it is only in the Apocrypha, second book of Esdras, that the 10 tribes of Israel are last mentioned. Second book of Esdras, chapter 13, verses 40 through 45. It says, "The 10 tribes, which were carried away as prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hoshea, whom the king of Assyria led away captive, and led them over the water, which thereafter they were brought into a strange land. But then they took counsel among themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where no mankind dwelt. This was in order to keep the law that they had not kept in their own land." It says they then traveled through the narrow passages of the river Euphrates, and the Most High did wonders before them, stopping the flow of the river until they was passed over. It is from there that they took a journey through a land that is a far distance away, which is known as Arsareth, and they have dwelt there until the later times. So something to point out is the Israelites was brought across the river Euphrates by the Assyrians, but the second book of Esdras insinuated that they crossed back over that river Euphrates going down south until they reached the isolated part of the earth where no man dwelt. The only place you can end up traveling south of the Euphrates River is Arabia and Africa. Seeing as they wanted to be isolated from the rest of the known world at the time, it is plausible that they migrated into Africa, which is one of the largest continents in the world. And this could be the reason why there are still Israelite tribes in Africa which still keep the laws of Moses, as we'll explain further into the video. As for the rest of the tribes which remained in the southern part of the kingdom, which is known as Judah, where the word Jew comes from, they also would go into captivity at various times, similar to that of the northern kingdom. 200 years after the northern kingdom fell, the kingdom of Babylon came and took Judah into captivity. This would be the start of the diaspora of the Jews who were already at the time starting to scatter the earth. In Jeremiah chapter 43, there are Jews who chose to go back into Egypt rather than to be captured by the king of Babylon. But seeing as the Babylonian Empire stretched all the way into Egypt, it is likely that these Jews were captured or they migrated deeper into Africa. But according to the Bible, most of the Jews were brought into Babylon over the Euphrates River just like the northern tribes were. And in similar fashion, they also crossed back over the river Euphrates to return to their homeland. This occurred in 500 BC when the Persian Empire took over, expanding from Iran all the way down into Egypt. In the book of Ezra, chapter 7, verses 12 through 13, the king of Persia said unto Ezra the priest that all the people of Israel in his realm could return to Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom of Judah. In Ezra chapter 8, verse 31, it even says the part of the river they crossed over to make it back to Jerusalem. It is possible that the 10 tribes of Israel could have also been a part of this migration, but it's hard to tell. In the second chapter of Ezra, it does say that there were a group of Israelites that returned along with them, but they struggled to trace back their genealogy to the land of Israel. So it's unclear whether these came from the 10 northern tribes. But what we do know is this return of the Jews to the land of Israel would only be a short-lived moment in history, as Ezra proclaimed in chapter 9, verse 7, from the days of our ancestors until now, our guilt has been great. Because of our sins, we and our kings and our priests have been subjected to sword and captivity, as it is today. Nehemiah, who also was a part of the return to Jerusalem, doubled down on the Jews being scattered among the nations if they were to remain unfaithful to the law of Moses. The Gentile nations, which consisted of the Romans and the Greeks at the time, will play a major role in the scattering of Israelites. When these empires came into power, they both ruled over the entire nation of ancient Israel. The Hebrews would go on to have animosity and conflicts with the Gentiles because the two did not mix well together culturally and religiously. It was important for the Hebrews to maintain their identity as Yahuah's chosen people to be a light to the rest of the world, and this consisted of keeping his laws, statutes, and commandments. The culture of the Greeks and Romans, however, would have been the complete opposite of the Hebrews, as they believed in many different gods. They were pagans, and they had their own set of beliefs when it comes to morality. So this rivalry led to the Jews being kicked out of their land and persecuted all throughout the Roman Empire. It is said that the Romans deported 12 boatloads of Jews to Cyrene, Libya in 132 AD. So this was a last-ditch effort by the Jews to defeat Rome, who had already previously captured Jerusalem and razed the Holy Temple to the ground. This failed revolt also led the Romans to change the name of the land of Judah to the land of Syria Palestinia. Since then, the land of Judah became the possessions of many nations. So where did all those Jews go who were kicked out of their land? Seeing as they were enemies of Rome and even expelled from Rome at one point, it makes the most sense that these Jews would avoid settling in the Roman Empire. And seeing as barbarians ruled over the northern parts of Europe, it makes sense that they also would have avoided settling in those lands. Due to the law of Moses, Israelites, especially at the time, considered Gentiles to be unclean, especially those who were still barbarians. So the Jews who fought so hard not to be under Roman authority, certainly they wouldn't want to rub shoulders with the Germanic barbarian tribes of the north. Unlike some.
Deep into your souls, listen, we know the history. We gave our lives to write down all the truth.
With that said, just as the Jews did in past times, they traveled down south into Egypt once more. There are still ancient ruins in Elephantine, Egypt, which shows there was once a Judean presence there. But the migration of the Jews did not stop in Egypt, as Egypt was still a province of Rome at the time. The Bible itself tells us exactly where the children of Israel were scattered to. Zephaniah 3:10 says, "From beyond the rivers of Cush, Ethiopia, my worshippers, my scattered people, will bring me offerings." So the scattering of the Jews did not stop in Egypt or Ethiopia. They traveled over the Nile River, going further into the interior of Africa. So as we know today, is there any proof of there being Jews in the land of Africa? Well, there actually are a group of Jews who just so happen to come from Ethiopia, and they was acknowledged by the Ashkenazi Jews and even brought back to the land of Israel. And the only way they are able to go back to the land of Israel is by a very selective process, which just so happens to be overseen by those same Ashkenazi Jews. There's even stories of these Ethiopian Jews being sterilized as they arrived to the land of Israel. Now, it is of no surprise that there are Jews in the land of Ethiopia, as they have been there for centuries. Africans weren't Gentiles, they already knew Yahuah long before. In fact, a black Ethiopian man who was traveling to Jerusalem was converted to Christianity while along the way, and he was a court official of the Queen of Ethiopia. It is evidence that they knew God long before, as this Ethiopian was reading the book of Isaiah.
Beta Israel, the Jewish lost tribe of Dan in Ethiopia. The Beta Israel community, also known as Ethiopian Jews, resided in Ethiopia for centuries. They have a unique religious and cultural identity, combining elements of Judaism with Ethiopian tradition. In the late 20th century, a significant number of Beta Israel members immigrated to Israel under the law of return. Genetic studies have suggested a genetic connection between the Beta Israel and other Jewish populations. The Beta Israel, also known as Ethiopian Jews, are considered one of the oldest diaspora Jewish communities. The Bible references Jews in Ethiopia, particularly in the region known as Cush. The prophet Isaiah mentions Jews who were exiled to various lands, including Cush. Additionally, the story of Eldad Ha-Dani in the 9th century gained attention, stating that the tribe of Dan migrated to Cush instead of participating in the conflict between Rehoboam and Jeroboam.
Ethiopia is one of the oldest Christian nations in the entire world. They also have one of the world's oldest Bibles predating Christian Europe as well as Islam. This Judean/Christian empire of Ethiopia stretched all the way into Arabia. The fall of this kingdom paved the way for Islam to rise. This is the reason the rise of Islam is called the Year of the Elephant. It was black Ethiopians that rode elephants who were defeated in the Arabian Peninsula. This led to even more Jews escaping into Africa to avoid persecution from the newly founded religion of Islam. As Islam spread west across Africa, many Africans, as well as black Jews, were forced to convert or be enslaved or killed. Many Jews converted to Islam, but sometimes they were allowed to keep their faith as long as they paid taxes to the rulers at the time. So by the year 7050 AD, you have both Catholic Rome in the north and Islam in the south, both conquering nations in the name of their religion. So the Jews who were caught up in the brutal conflict of the religious extremists on both sides either chose between the lesser of the two evils, or they chose to flee deeper into Africa to avoid both sides.
According to Mr. Windsor, the Yahudim came into the Western Sudan from northern and eastern Africa as a result of a series of migrations due to persecution. As they migrated, they adopted new methods from other people and left their material, educational, and moral imprint among the people with whom they resided. At the same time that the Jews were migrating westward across the Sudan from Ethiopia, they also migrated southward from Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco to the fertile regions between the Senegal and Niger rivers. When the Yahudim from the north and the east met between these two rivers, they established a confluence or crossroad in West Africa, where men could exchange their culture, ideas, and merchandise. These migrations of the Yahudim went on with great frequency about 300 AD, and they continued with regularity for about 1200 years. In Joseph Williams' book, Hebrewisms of West Africa, on page 342, he has this map that points out the course of the Jewish migration from northeastern Africa. He writes that the Jews migrated up the Nile, passing Memphis, Elephantine, Khartoum, and they turned west at Kordofan in central Sudan. In the region of the White Nile, Williams believes some Jews settled in the country of Shaluk in the southern Sudan and Uganda. He continues by tracing the migration from Kordofan going west to Darfur, Lake Chad, Kano, and then to the countries of the Niger River.
Shout out to Truth Unedited. So according to Rudolph Windsor's book, From Babylon to Timbuktu, the Jews migrated west of the Nile River, going deep into sub-Saharan Africa. This is exactly what the Bible says in Zephaniah 3:10.
According to tradition, our ancestors came from northeast Africa. They came down from Kemet. They followed the river Nile. They crossed it and arrived in the Congo Basin. And there in the Congo Basin, they started building a kingdom The greatest kingdom is known as the Kingdom of Congo, which had its...
So to most of the known world, Africa was only made up of Libya, Egypt, and Ethiopian nations. These were mostly in the northern parts of Africa. So if you check out old maps, you won't see the full continent of Africa being shown because most of Africa at that time was uncharted territory. For example, this 1508 map shows a small reduced size of the continent of Africa. And what should be the bottom portion of Africa, they decided to draw over it with the Atlantic Ocean. So it was these vast amount of Jews that settled in the uncharted territory of Africa. So this diaspora of the Jews, which started at the Congo, is what led to more than 400 Bantu tribes in Africa today. And many of them still hang on to their ancient Hebrew customs that they brought along with them.
Other groups that are considered lost tribes.
Correct. Lemba are fascinatingly unique because we could trace them directly to the oldest Jewish exile community in the world from Yemen. And the Yemenite Jewish community, when they came back to Israel, they had customs that were preserved for 2,000 years uninterrupted. Even some of their pronunciation of Hebrew letters were unique as far as how the Ashkenazim and Sephardim pronounced their letters, but no one challenged them saying it's unauthentic. It was as authentic it can get.
The Lemba, the Black Jews of southern Africa with Jewish priestly DNA. The Lemba people are a Bantu-speaking group found in Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Malawi. They claim to be descendants of a Jewish ancestor who migrated from the Middle East thousands of years ago. Some genetic studies have shown that a portion of their male lineages share a genetic marker known as the Cohen modal haplotype, which is associated with the Jewish priestly lineage, Kohanim.
So the Lemba tribe can trace their lineage back all the way to the Levitical priesthood of Aaron. Leo Africanus, a 16th century historian, gave account of there being black Jews in the southern parts of Africa. Leo described these black Jews as Kafri, which means non-Islamic Negroes. According to him, they were as black as a pitch, of mighty stature, and as some think descended of the Jews, and their geographical heartland was the southern parts of Africa. So next up we have the Zafin Ibrahim, which means descendants of Abraham. They were located off the southern east coast of Africa on an island called Malagasy Republic, which is also known as Madagascar. And according to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, a vast majority of Malagasys believe they are descended from the Jews. They believe Madagascar was settled by Jews since ancient times, and there was a speculation that the island was associated with ancient Ufur, which is mentioned in the Book of Kings during the reign of King Solomon. And in West Africa, you have Jews who give a similar account to that of the Jews in South Africa. These Jews made up the Songhai Empire, which later became known as Balad el Sudan. And here's a backstory to how they arrived in that part of Africa. Legend has it these Jews came from Yemen. They settled near the Niger River and established the Songhai Kingdom, which was initially a Hebrew kingdom, as mentioned in Tariq as-Sadan. On page 4 of Tariq as-Sadan, it says, quote, "As for the first king, Za el-Yamin, the origins of this term means he came from Yemen. It is said that he and his brother left out of Yemen in the land of Allah the Most High unto the land of Gao, which they were destined and is very old in the coast of the sea in the land of Saga." So seeing as the Songhai Empire was still a Hebrew kingdom, it is likely that they left Yemen to avoid persecution. So as these Jews left Yemen and entered the Ethiopian region, they ended up crossing the Nile rivers and venturing far into sub-Saharan Africa, similar to what Zephaniah 3:10 says. Now the rulers of this kingdom were known as the Za dynasty, with Za el-Yamin being the one who founded this region. This dynasty came to an end in the 12th century when the Mali Empire took over. This region later became known as Balad el Sudan, which means land of the blacks in Arabic. After the fall of the Mali Empire, the Jews regained control of the land once more, but instead of remaining a Hebrew kingdom, their king, Sani Ali, thought it best that they should convert to Islam for better trading opportunities.
With regards to the children of Israel, as in if you call them the Hebrews, if you like. So many of those became Muslims as Islam came, the same way as many of the Christians became Muslims.
So there has always been a black, Arab, Muslim connection throughout history, even up until this day. The first to convert to Islam was most likely the Hamitic people. You had the Moors of North Africa, who were likely Berbers, and then you had Mansa Musa from West Africa. He was the first Muslim ruler in West Africa. After that, the Hebrews began to convert to Islam as well. And even to this day, there are still Black Americans who claim to be of the Nation of Islam. So both in the north and western parts of Africa, a significant amount of Africans and Blacks became Muslims. Alan Godbey, who wrote the Lost Tribes of Myth book, testifies to this. On a quest to find the lost tribes in Africa, he stumbled upon these Jews. Here's a quote from one of the passages. It says, "Was unable to distinguish a Jew from a Mohammedan while passing along the streets of Algeria, Constantine, and Tunis. It is remarkable that among the non-Jewish natives, there are seen many Jews of Negro type, showing a decided Negro infusion. Similarly, the nomad Dagadans or Berber Jews of Sahara resemble in all respects to those other tribes amongst whom they live, and physically are hardly distinguishable from the Mohammedan neighbors, aside from being somewhat fairer in skin color," he says. So this is the reason why Arabs call the western region of Africa Balad el Sudan, or Negro land, because it was hard to distinguish both Africans and Hebrews amongst each other. Many of them became Muslim, and they also spoke the Arabic language. And if you need proof of that, a man by the name of Omar Said was brought from West Africa, and he was enslaved and transported to the United States during the 18th century. He was a scholar who both wrote and spoke in Arabic, also well versed in the Quran, but later in his life he would end up converting to Christianity. Other Jews mentioned in the Lost Tribes of Myth book is the Yoruba Jews. Quote, "These Yoruba Jews claim their ancestors were driven from oasis to oasis by the Muslim persecution, not finding rest even when they reached Timbuktu. At present, they number about 2,000 people in 20 little villages, calling themselves by the Hebrew name B'nai Ephraim. They have copies of portions of the Torah kept in the most holy place. They retain certain Jewish customs and observe the great holy days. Otherwise, they are simply naked Negro savages, as described by one of themselves." End of quote. In the same region of the Yoruba people, you also have Nigeria's Igbo Jews, who also claim to be of the lost tribes of Israel. The Igbo people have some of the same customs as the Hebrews, and this was written down in the book called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equino. He was an Igbo man who was kidnapped and brought to America as a slave, but later brought himself out of slavery and wrote the first autobiography by an enslaved man. In his book, he admits his people, the Igbos, have the same customs as the Jews, and also his name has biblical meaning, probably being related to Judah. And it is said that a major source of the slaves who were brought to Virginia as well as the American South came out of Igbo land. There was even slave advertisements that was posted mentioning these Negroes as fine Hebos. Hebo is said to have derived from the word Hebrew. So these Hebos or Hebrews were one of the main ethnic groups being enslaved during the Atlantic slave trade. Also mentioned in the Lost Tribes of Myth book is the Imo Yo Kaim people. They were labeled as strange people by their Muslim neighbors. It says they were south of the Timbuktu region, and their tradition is that their ancestors came from Morocco, a fact which was supported by their language, a mixture of Arabic as well as local Negro speech. Now, seeing as their ancestors came from Morocco, it is most likely that their ancestors were the Spanish Jews who were exiled out of Spain. Now, the Jews of Spain were close with the African Muslims, so the Spanish rulers at the time didn't trust them, so they ended up expelling them all out of Spain. And mind you, these Jews had lived in Spain for centuries, so they was kicked out of their homes and they had to go to the next closest place, which was Morocco, Africa. It says it is there where the Jews took refuge with the Berbers in the lofty mountains of the desert. The Lost Tribes of Myth book also says there is a large Jewish community in the interior of Dahomey, and their principal laws are engraved on plaster tablets. They likely wrote in Hebrew, and Judaism was a matter of oral tradition. They clung to the Sabbath. They had certain Jewish customs, as well as having a high priest. So they kept all these customs despite being surrounded by pagan influences. So up to this point, we know there was various tribes that lived in the parts of West Africa, and that's why it became known as Negro Land, or Land of the Blacks. And it is there where you had Negro Jews from Spain, as well as the Negro Jews from North Africa and the Negro Jews from Yemen, all coming together at a cross section in probably one of the world's most important areas when it comes to trading at the time. So most of the West African Jews arrived there to get in on the trading opportunities. They all became known as the Jews of the Balad el Sudan. In their respective history, they were present there in Ghana, Mali, the Mazi kingdoms, as well as the Songhai empires. This area of the Black Jews, which was known as Negro Land, will become the exact area the transatlantic slave trade took place. This all transpired around the same time as the Jews were expelled from Spain. If you look at the old maps of Negro Land, you can see the slave coast is right underneath it, which was once known as the Kingdom of Judah, which brings us even more confirmation that there was indeed Jews in sub-Saharan Africa. And these maps were the maps that the Portuguese used to kidnap these slaves, so they knew exactly who they were taking and from where they was taking them. They were taking Jews who once were part of a small kingdom called Judah on the coast of Africa. So millions of Jews were taken into captivity from the slave coast, formerly known as the Kingdom of Judah. This did not stop until the 1860s, and the only other port in Africa to compare to this is Luanda in Central Africa. Now, those enslaved from Central Africa were also Jews, known as the Black Portuguese. Similar to the map that showed the slave coast being the Kingdom of Judah, there's another map showing the Black Portuguese Jews coming from the Luango coast. You can see on the map that it says area of the Jews as well as Gulf of the Jews. And the Portuguese who drew these maps up knew there were Jews there because they were responsible for bringing them there. So here's what the Lost Tribes of Myth book had to say about the Black Portuguese. It says, on the Cabinda coast in Portuguese West Africa is an interesting group of Negro Jews known as the Mavamba. They were considered to be connected to a colony of Jews expelled from Portugal who settled in San Tome Island, and the Portuguese discovered San Tome in 1471. It says King John II of Portugal in 1484 offered the Jews of his dominion the pleasant alternative of submitting to baptism or settling at San Tome. But the real story is many Jews from Spain settled in Portugal as a safe haven from the Spanish Inquisition. They were expelled in 1492 by the rulers of Spain, but in 1496, King Manuel of Portugal allowed Jews to remain in his kingdom as long as they paid their taxes. Any Jews who refused to pay this tax, he punished them by deporting their children to San Tome. And these children were only in their age ranges of between 2 and 10. So they were brought to San Tome and they were raised as Roman Catholics and worked in the sugar trade where they had to fend off crocodiles. So if you're unfamiliar where Sao Tome is located, it is right in the middle of what used to be the Slave Coast and the Gulf of the Jews, which is central part of Africa. It is said the Portuguese discovered this small island located by Africa in the 15th century, and it was uninhabited by the time. There were sugar plantations found on the island, but it required a large labor force in which the Portuguese population was too small to provide. So they brought over Hebrew children as slaves to work the plantations at the time. So a century before they even embarked to the Americas to set up plantations, it was here in Saint Tome that these Negroes, the Black Portuguese, would be the very first ones to perform slave labor successfully on a colonial plantation. Despite being kidnapped at a very young age and being brought to an island full of crocodiles, these Hebrew babies showed they can endure and prevail against all odds. And by doing so, some of them were able to escape and establish their own community in the central parts of Africa known as the Luango region. So the children of the Black Portuguese who came from Saint Tome ended up becoming the Luango Jews, aka Congo Jews. Here's what James Pritchard had to say about the Luango Jews in his book called Physical Ethnography of the African Races. He says many Jews settled in the country who retain their religious rights and the distinct habits which keep them isolated from other nations. Though they separate from the African population, they are black and resemble the other Negroes in every respect as to physical characters. So these Black Portuguese Jews settled in Congo as well as Angola, and it wasn't long before these regions became colonized by Portugal. So it was only a generation later that these same Portuguese Jews were brought over to Brazil to work the sugar plantations there. So why did Black people or Black Jews become the optimal choice in performing slave labor in the New World? They were chosen for the same reason their forefathers was chosen as slaves in ancient Egypt. Remember in Exodus when the Egyptians tried to depopulate the Hebrews by hard labor in a hot climate, yet they grew even larger in numbers? Well, this will be the case once again. The Portuguese, as well as the other Europeans that came along, knew that Negroes, these Black Hebrews, were well suited for these conditions as this is the climate that they come from. They knew themselves that they would not be able to perform under such conditions. And secondly, the native populations that they also enslaved and had attempted for them to perform slave labor, but these native populations were dying off in large masses just from being around these European settlers. So the most suitable and reliable candidates became the Negro Jews from Africa. They were shipped off into the New World by the millions, with Portugal leading the way. So the kidnapped Hebrew babies from Portugal will be one of the first Negroes to perform slave labor in the New World. And praise be to the Most High that they were able to survive and prevail in these conditions, becoming one of the largest Black populations on their side of America, which is Brazil, closely followed by the Black Americans in the United States, who are also one of the largest Black populations. So now we understand why the author who wrote the book, The Lost Tribes, a Myth, came to the conclusion that Judaism amongst American Negroes should be considered. He is quoted saying, "Hundreds of thousands of slaves were brought to America from West Africa during the days of traffic beginning nearly 400 years ago," which I just want to point out is the exact amount of years that God told Abraham in Genesis. But he goes on to say how much more of Judaism survived amongst West African Negroes in that earlier time. As persecuted communities, they were rather more in danger than other Negroes of being raided by war parties and sold as slaves. And that is referring to the African Hamites who had a role in the transatlantic slave trade. And lastly, he says, it may be considered certain that many partially Judaized Negroes were among the slaves brought to America. How many of them might still hold some Jewish customs in their new home is another question. Well, maybe if they didn't whip it out of us and change our names, we probably would have had a good idea of who we are a long time ago. But one thing's for certain is they knew who we were all along. One of the very first settlements in Manhattan, New York was called the Land of the Blacks, which is very similar to Negro Land, as well as the village of the Blacks in Portugal, where Jews with the last name Negro presided over, which must be by coincidence that the same residents who lived in Manhattan's Land of the Blacks had the same last names as the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Negro, Portuguese, Spaniard, San Tome, Congo, Angola. Well, I'm going to just leave it there. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and Yah bless.